When you look at a massive multi-trillion euro budget, you usually, brace yourself for incredibly dry accounting.
Yeah, you just expect endless rows of line items and bureaucratic percentages.
Exactly. But if you know how to read the math, you suddenly stop seeing euros and cents. You actually start seeing the exposed geopolitical fault lines of, well, an entire continent.
Because a supranational budget like this is never just a financial document. I mean, it is a mathematical expression of political anxiety.
Right. It maps out what a government is terrified of losing and what they're desperately trying to secure for their own survival. So, welcome to this extra episode of Diplomacy and International Relations, a podcast focused on international relations, global politics, and Danish political developments.
Oh, we have a highly complex geopolitical web to untangle for you today.
We really do. Our analytical mission for you today is to explore the European Union's proposed €2 trillion budget for 2028 to 2034. We're going to look at Denmark's strategic priorities within that framework and then follow the money northward to examine Greenland's fierce push for autonomy.
Especially amid escalating superpower interest in the Arctic, which is just fascinating right now.
Oh, it's wild. But before we get into the sources, please make sure you follow and subscribe to the podcast. And just a quick reminder, you can also follow iCulture Talking on Instagram.
So we're basically tracing a trajectory from the macroeconomic architecture of European defense all the way down to the structural realities of territorial sovereignty.
Right, and the deeply personal historical struggles of the Inuit population in Greenland. But to understand the end game, we have to start with the money.
We always do.
Yeah. So we're looking at the European Commission's proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework, or the MFF. This covers 2028 to 2034, and it is a massive €2 trillion blueprint.
Which represents, what, about 1.26% of the entire EU's gross national income?
Exactly. But what jumps off the page immediately isn't just the sheer volume of cash. It's the aggressive, undeniable pivot toward defense and security.
Oh, the reallocation of priorities is just staggering compared to previous cycles. The Commission is proposing €131 billion for a newly created European Competitiveness Fund, which is specifically ring-fenced for defense and space initiatives.
And to put that in perspective for you, that is a five-fold increase over the current budget.
Exactly. We are not just talking about administrative grants here. This translates into physical realities, like expanding production lines for artillery, investing in dual-use satellite networks, and fortifying cyber infrastructure.
Wow. Plus, there is a €200 billion Global Europe instrument, and on top of that, a potential €100 billion earmarked specifically for the reconstruction and integration of Ukraine.
It really reads like a financial blueprint for a continent that has suddenly woken up to the fact that it can no longer outsource its security umbrella.
Definitely. But, €2 trillion is a massive bill to foot, and to pay for it, the Commission isn't just sending a bigger invoice to the member states, they're actually hunting for entirely new revenue streams.
Which introduces some really heavy geopolitical mechanisms.
Yeah, they are proposing targeted adjustments to the emissions trading system and implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM. Can you break down how that actually generates revenue while acting as a geopolitical tool?
Sure. So the carbon border adjustment mechanism is it's a perfect example of how the EU uses market access as leverage.
Right.
Historically, European companies subject to strict carbon taxes faced unfair competition from foreign companies who could produce cheap, dirty steel or cement because, their home countries lacked environmental regulations.
Right. That makes sense.
So CBAM essentially slaps a tariff on those carbon-intensive imports right at the EU border. If you want to sell your steel into the European market, you have to pay a price that mirrors the EU's internal carbon tax.
So it generates billions in new revenue for this multi-trillion euro budget, but it also simultaneously forces global supply chains to either adopt European environmental standards or lose market access.
Exactly. And along with proposed levies on non-collected e-waste, tobacco, and corporate resources for large multinationals, the Commission is trying to build a self-sustaining financial engine.
Which naturally brings us to how individual member states are reacting. Denmark, leading the initial negotiations under its council presidency, has staked out a very firm position.
Led by Finance Minister Nicolai Wammen, right?
Yes. He has explicitly demanded modernization and fair burden sharing. He stated that, quote, status quo is not an option. Yet he also drew a hard line, insisting that Denmark's financial rebates remain completely unchanged.
That really sets the stage for a classic grueling European negotiation, particularly because Denmark is a net contributor to the EU budget.
Right. But the most intense friction we are seeing in the source material isn't actually between the member states.
No, the real institutional battle is the fierce contradiction between the European Commission and the European Parliament.
This part is fascinating. The Commission wants to radically streamline how this massive budget is spent. They are proposing the introduction of national and regional partnership plans, which would consolidate dozens of various regional funds into one single overarching plan per member state.
Which sounds efficient on paper, but...
Let me stop you there,
Okay.
because this is where the bureaucratic language masks a massive shift in power. If we think about this in everyday terms, the Commission is basically proposing to give each member state a teenager's blank check expense account.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. They are saying, here is your lump sum for the year, you manage it. Meanwhile, the Parliament is demanding a strict itemized allowance. If you consolidate all these highly specific funds into one national bucket, isn't Parliament entirely justified in fearing a complete loss of democratic oversight?
Oh, that is precisely the argument Parliament is making. Led by co-rapporteurs Siegfried Moraine and Carla Tavares, they are vehemently opposing this single plan structure.
Because it kills transparency.
Yeah, exactly. Their argument is that merging policies into one overarching plan per country drastically reduces that transparency. If agriculture, technology, and infrastructure funds are all pooled together, national governments could redirect money in ways that create unfair competition or violate EU values without immediate oversight.
So Parliament is demanding that critical areas, especially agriculture and cohesion funding, remain strictly ring-fenced.
Yes, and they aren't just fighting over how the money is managed, they're fighting over the total amount. Parliament actually wants a larger overall budget.
Right, they're pushing for 1.27% of gross national income, plus an additional protected 0.11%, specifically to repay the debt incurred from the Next Generation EU Pandemic Recovery Fund.
They are sending a very clear warning that administrative simplification simply cannot come at the expense of parliamentary accountability.
But to understand why Parliament is so anxious about who controls the purse strings, you really have to look at where some of this money is actually going.
Yeah, when you sift through the macro-level budget fights, you find highly strategic, targeted line items that reflect the EU's broader geopolitical fears.
Which brings us directly to one of the most fascinating allocations in the entire framework, and that's the massive surge in funding for Greenland.
The Arctic Premium.
Exactly. Under the Overseas Countries and Territories Instrument, or the OCT, the EU plans to more than double its annual funding for Greenland.
We are looking at a jump from roughly 32 million euros to nearly 76 million euros a year, starting in 2028.
The European Commission is no longer treating these territories as distant afterthoughts. They are explicitly framing Greenland as a critical outpost.
And that phrasing is highly intentional. In 2023, the EU and Greenland signed a comprehensive memorandum of understanding designating Greenland as a strategic supplier of critical raw materials.
Because if the EU is going to fund a massive green transition and build independent defense supply chains, they need rare earth minerals.
Right. And Greenland possesses some of the largest unexploded deposits on the planet. Brussels is attempting to lock in exclusive, or at least highly preferential, access to those resources before other global actors can monopolize them.
But, you cannot talk about global actors wooing Greenland without looking across the Atlantic. The United States has been circling this territory for years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in 2019, Donald Trump famously and very bluntly expressed a desire for the United States to simply buy Greenland.
Yeah, and Washington uses incredibly heavy rhetoric about the absolute necessity of countering Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic.
But when you actually look at the financial data provided in our sources, there's a glaring discrepancy. The contrast between the diplomatic rhetoric and the financial reality is staggering.
It really is. I want you to consider these numbers. According to the data, U.S. obligated foreign aid to Greenland peaked at just $8.1 million in 2021.
And then by fiscal year 2024, that number plummeted to a mere $545,900.
Less than 600 grand. And that recent aid was entirely economic, channeled through U.S.-based partners like universities and government agencies for higher education initiatives and transnational crime prevention.
Right.
So I have to ask, Is U.S. strategy in the Arctic mostly bark and very little financial bite? I mean, $500,000 is basically pocket change compared to the EU locking in 76 million euros annually.
Well, it looks disproportionate until you factor in the different mechanisms of power.
Yeah.
The U.S. financial aid is incredibly low because Washington historically relies on its military and security umbrella to project influence.
Right. They operate the Pacific Space Base.
Exactly, formerly Thule Air Base, which is a cornerstone of the U.S. missile warning system. For decades, Washington felt that its military footprint basically guaranteed its influence.
But that very lack of direct economic investment from the U.S. is exactly what is forcing the EU's hand today. Brussels realizes that military bases do not build local economies.
Exactly. To secure those critical minerals, the EU has to lock in its alliance with the Greenlandic government in Nuuk through heavy structural financial funding. Otherwise, they risk leaving an economic vacuum that Beijing is more than willing to fill.
Which highlights a crucial dynamic. Greenland is currently playing the EU and the US off each other with incredible skill. But to understand why Nuuk is so aggressively navigating this superpower attention today, we have to look backward.
We really do. We have to understand the historical trauma of being treated as a strategic pawn by outside powers.
Right. They're leveraging their current position because of the deep structural scars left by Danish colonial rule.
The history of the mid to late 20th century in Greenland is a textbook example of systemic cultural and economic engineering. Take the U.S. military footprint we just mentioned.
In 1953, the U.S. military needed to expand that very base in Thule.
And with the explicit agreement of the Danish government in Copenhagen, over 100 members of the local Inuit Thule tribe, the Inuit, were forcibly relocated from their ancestral hunting grounds in a matter of days.
They were pushed into harsh, unfamiliar territory simply to make room for American radar arrays.
And at almost the exact same time, Denmark initiated what were known as the G50 and G60 modernization policies.
On paper, these were development plans. But what was the actual mechanism behind them? Why did Copenhagen push for such rapid, state-led urbanization?
Well, the economic logic from Copenhagen's perspective was to transform Greenland from a traditional hunting society into a modernized, export-driven fishing industry.
And to do that, they needed to centralize the population.
Exactly. They systematically closed down small, remote settlements and forced the Inuit population to relocate into larger concrete apartment blocks in a few concentrated towns.
It was an abrupt, traumatic urbanization process that fundamentally fractured the traditional Inuit way of life and social structures.
And they embedded structural inequality right into the economic system.
Yeah. The sources detail the birthplace criterion implemented during this era. This was a formalized, legal rule where Danish workers who moved to Greenland were paid significantly higher wages and given vastly superior housing and benefits compared to Inuit workers performing the exact same jobs.
It wasn't hidden at all. It was a deliberate economic mechanism designed to incentivize mainland Danes to move to the island, artificially altering the demographic makeup.
And ensuring Danish control over the new administrative sectors.
The physical and economic relocations were devastating, but the cultural assimilation efforts were arguably more aggressive.
Right. In 1951, Danish authorities initiated what is now known as the Little Baines experiment.
They removed 22 Inuit children from their families and relocated them to foster homes in Denmark.
The stated goal was to strip them of their language and culture, mold them into a Danish-speaking elite, and send them back to govern Greenland in Copenhagen's image. The psychological toll on those children was just catastrophic.
And that mindset culminated in the 1960s and 70s with the Coil campaign, which is really one of the darkest chapters in this shared history.
Yeah, Danish doctors systematically forced intrauterine devices, or coils, on thousands of Inuit women and girls, some as young as 12.
In many cases, this was done without their knowledge, and certainly without informed consent. The sheer scale of this is hard to comprehend.
It affected roughly half of the fertile Inuit female population at the time. It was a calculated demographic intervention that successfully halved the Greenlandic birth rate, dropping it from an average of 7 children per woman down to 2.3 in just a few years.
The gravity of that historical wound is driving a massive political reckoning today, and we must note a heavy contradiction currently playing out in the legal sphere regarding the Coil campaign.
Oh, right. Following public outcries, Denmark and Greenland launched an independent inquiry which led to an official apology from the Danish Prime Minister and a compensation scheme for the survivors.
However, an independent expert group recently submitted a separate report to the Greenlandic government, investigating whether the deliberate targeting of the Inuit birth rate legally constituted genocide.
And that classification remains a fierce point of contention and debate among legal scholars. But the very fact that a genocide investigation was submitted to the government illustrates the profound, lingering trauma of those assimilation policies.
It completely reframes how you view their modern political evolution. The drive for autonomy isn't just about administrative preference, it is about self-preservation.
Exactly. That history fueled the push for the 1979 Home Rule Act. It drove the 1982 referendum where Greenland voted to pull out of the European Economic Community, a move they formalized in 1985.
And ultimately, it culminated in the critical 2009 Self-Government Act.
Yes, the 2009 Act is the foundational document of modern Greenland. It recognized Greenlanders as a distinct people under international law, with the explicit right to self-determination.
It handed over legislative and administrative control of most domestic affairs, crucially including the management of the vital mineral resource sector. And it recognized Greenlandic as the sole official language.
But the economic mechanism built into that 2009 Act is brilliant. It functions essentially like a prenup with a strict expiration date.
A prenup, I like that. How does the math work?
So currently, Denmark provides Greenland with an annual block grant of 3.4 billion Danish kroner. That grant makes up roughly 50% of Greenland's entire government revenue. It keeps the territory running.
Right.
However, the Act stipulates that if Greenland starts generating over 75 million kroners from its own mineral resources, that Danish grant begins to shrink.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for every krone earned over that 75 million threshold, the Danish block grant is reduced by 50% of that excess. When the grant eventually is clawed back to zero, it discontinues entirely.
And at that exact moment, formal negotiations for full state independence begin.
Exactly. It is a highly pragmatic legal framework. It ties sovereign independence directly to economic self-sufficiency.
It provides a mathematical structured pathway out of colonial dependency, ensuring that if Greenland breaks away, it has the financial engine required to sustain itself as a state.
Which explains exactly what Greenland is doing today. Building on that 2009 framework, we are seeing Nuuk engage in highly aggressive paradiplomacy.
They aren't waiting for the block grant to hit zero. They're acting like an independent nation on the global stage right now.
The scope of their international engagement is unprecedented for a territory that is technically still part of the Danish realm.
They have opened their own representative offices in Brussels, Washington, Reykjavik, and Beijing, and they are actively planning to expand that diplomatic footprint.
And let's talk about what having those physical offices actually achieves. It allows Nuuk to bypass the colonial middleman. When the EU wants to discuss critical minerals or Washington wants to discuss Arctic security, Greenland's diplomats are in the room.
They even bypassed Denmark's initial territorial exclusion to independently join the Paris Agreement in 2023.
Yeah, and in 2024, they released their own Arctic strategy. The title of that document tells you everything you need to know about their current mindset. It's titled, "Nothing About Us Without Us."
They are unequivocally demanding an equal seat at the table.
In fact, they recently boycotted high-level meetings of both the Arctic Council and the Nordic Council specifically because they were denied equal voting seats alongside Denmark.
They are utilizing this paradiplomacy as a vital survival tool. By asserting their presence globally, they are meticulously untangling themselves from Copenhagen's foreign policy apparatus.
They are attempting to balance urgent economic development and the protection of indigenous rights against the overwhelming strategic interests of global superpowers.
They are laying the groundwork so that when the US, the EU, or China look at the Arctic, they are forced to negotiate directly with Nuuk on Greenland's terms.
And they are actively preparing for the ultimate goal. A draft constitution for an independent Greenland was completed in 2023.
Which firmly asserts the inalienable principle of popular common ownership of all land and resources.
Right, but when you look at the recent polling data, the population is viewing this through a highly pragmatic lens. The polling reveals a fascinating tension between sovereign pride and economic reality.
What do the numbers say?
Recent data shows that 56% of Greenlanders support full independence. However, 45% stated they would reject independence if it resulted in a drop in their standard of living.
So they want sovereignty, but they are acutely aware of how much their schools and hospitals currently rely on that Danish block grant.
Exactly. Furthermore, regarding the superpower competition we discussed, a massive 85% of the population strongly oppose the idea of joining or being controlled by the United States.
They want to be masters of their own house, but they know the roof still relies on Copenhagen's financial support, well, at least for now.
That's right. Greenland stands at a profound crossroads. Every diplomatic office they open, every raw material agreement they sign with the EU, and every dollar they attract in foreign investment is a calculated step toward crossing that 75 million kroner threshold, replacing the block grant, and firing up their own economic engine.
So let's take a step back and trace the journey we've taken today.
Right. We started at the macroeconomic level, looking at the massive shifts in the European Union's proposed multi-trillion euro budget. We saw Brussels frantically hunting for new revenue streams like the carbon border adjustment mechanism to fund an aggressive pivot toward defense, security, and securing critical supply chains.
And we watched the institutional friction between the Commission's desire for streamlined power and the Parliament's demand for strict democratic oversight.
Yes, and we saw how Denmark is navigating those turbulent financial waters, demanding modernization while holding the line on its own rebates. And finally, we followed that geopolitical anxiety northward to Greenland.
We saw the EU doubling its financial investment to secure a foothold in the Arctic, while Nuuk uses its hard-won autonomy to play the superpowers against each other, assert its sovereignty globally, and systematically heal the deep scars of its colonial past.
It perfectly illustrates how global finance, historical grievance, and territorial sovereignty are inextricably linked. You simply cannot understand the mechanics of the EU budget without understanding the geopolitics of the Arctic, and you cannot understand the strategic reality of the Arctic without understanding the Inuit struggle for self-determination.
It really is all connected.
Which leaves you with a final scenario to mull over, one that wasn't directly answered in our sources today. Imagine if tomorrow, a massive, easily accessible rare earth mineral discovery in Greenland instantly triggered that 2009 economic mechanism, generating enough revenue to zero out the Danish block grant overnight. Would true, stable independence smoothly follow? Or would a sudden, massive influx of unanchored wealth create an entirely new set of geopolitical vulnerabilities for Nuuk, inviting even more aggressive interference from global superpowers? When the geopolitical landscape shifts that rapidly, who actually benefits?
Something to really think about.
Thank you so much for your time today. Please make sure to follow the podcast, and if you found this analysis valuable, we explicitly ask you to leave a 5-star rating to help expand our reach.